There's a specific kind of silence that follows the moment your entire reality collapses. Not the peaceful kind, not the quiet you feel after a long day when you finally kick off your shoes and exhale. No, I mean the kind of silence that rings, the kind that fills your ears like pressure at the bottom of a swimming pool, when everything around you is muffled and distorted, and you can't quite tell which way is up. I was standing in my kitchen. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly because I had a pot of pasta on the stove, penne, the cheap store brand kind, because we were tightening our belts that month, or so I'd been told, and my phone buzzed on the counter, and I glanced down expecting a meme from my friend Carla, or maybe a reminder about a dentist appointment. Instead, I saw a name I hadn't expected: Sandra, my boyfriend's mother. The woman who had, for 3 years, looked at me with this particular cocktail of pity and suspicion, like I was something her son had tracked in on his shoe, but she was too polite to say so directly. She had texted me, and the message she sent, accidentally, as I'd later learn, because she thought she was forwarding it to her sister, was a screenshot of a conversation between her and my boyfriend, Marcus. A conversation in which he described in exhaustive and almost clinical detail every lie he told me, every person he told those lies about me too, and exactly how he planned to keep it all going. I turned off the stove. I sat down on the kitchen floor, and I thought, oh, so I wasn't crazy after all. This is the story of what happened next. I need you to understand what Marcus was like before I tell you what he did, because if I just skip to the ending, it won't land the way it deserves to. You'll think, well, why did she stay? You'll think, why didn't she see it? So let me paint you the picture. I met Marcus at a fundraiser for a local animal shelter. My friend Priya had dragged me there on a Saturday afternoon when I was deeply committed to a plan that involved my couch and a crime documentary series. He was volunteering at the check-in table, and he had this laugh, loud and unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that makes you instinctively smile even when you don't know what's funny. He was wearing a t-shirt with a dog's face on it that was slightly too small for him, and he looked completely unbothered by this. I thought, that's a man who is comfortable in his own skin. How wrong I was. We talked for 4 hours that afternoon. He told me about his work. He was a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, steady and practical, and about his dog, a rescue greyhound named Fig, and about how he'd grown up in a small town in Derbyshire before moving to Leeds for university and then to London, where we both lived. He asked me real questions, remembered my answers. When I mentioned I'd been having a rough year, my dad had passed away 18 months earlier, and I was still, honestly, not okay, he didn't pivot to himself or offer a clumsy platitude. He just said, quietly, that kind of grief doesn't have a deadline. You're allowed to still be in it. I cried a little, right there at the fundraiser. He handed me a napkin that had a cartoon paw print on it. I fell for him so fast it genuinely scared me. Within 6 months, I'd met his friends, spent 3 weekends at his flat, and had the conversation, the one where we agreed we were serious, that this was going somewhere, that we were, as the very grown-up adults we both were, in a committed relationship. He even met my mum, which, if you know anything about my mother, a sharp, skeptical Welsh woman who has never once been charmed by anyone on first meeting, you'd understand was significant. She liked him. She actually liked him. He seems grounded, she told me on the drive home. Coming from her, that was practically a marriage endorsement. The first year was genuinely lovely. I know people say that. The first year was good, and it sounds like the opening line of a tragedy, which I suppose it is, but I want to be clear. I wasn't in denial. I wasn't ignoring red flags with pink-tinted glasses. The first year was actually, measurably, evidentially good. He was attentive, he was consistent, he showed up when he said he would, he remembered that I hated coriander and that the sound of certain alarm tones triggered my anxiety, and that every year on my dad's birthday I needed to either go to the coast or stay completely home, no middle ground. That version of Marcus I loved deeply. The version that emerged in year 2, I didn't recognize him at first. That's the insidious thing about this kind of person. They don't change overnight. They drift, slowly enough that you keep recalibrating your own compass instead of questioning theirs. It started with small things. He began mentioning, in passing, that I'd said things I had no memory of saying. "You told me last week you didn't want to come to Dan's birthday." I hadn't. I'd been looking forward to it. "You said you were fine with me going away that weekend." I'd specifically said the opposite and felt hurt when he'd booked it anyway. At first, I genuinely wondered if I was misremembering. I've always been someone who second guesses herself, childhood trait, deeply installed, and Marcus knew that. So when he'd look at me with this patient, slightly exhausted expression and say, "Babe, this is the 3rd time this month you've forgotten a conversation," I felt a familiar pull of shame. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the grief had done something to my memory. Maybe I needed to keep better notes. I actually started keeping a journal specifically to track conversations. Later, I would understand what that journal really was: evidence. By year 3, a quiet but pervasive narrative had rooted in our social circle. I became, through no action I could pinpoint, the difficult one, the anxious one, the one who overreacted, who needed reassurance, who sometimes got the wrong end of things. I'd hear it back to me in small ways, a friend asking with careful gentleness if I was doing okay these days, Marcus's mate Jamie making a joke about how Marcus was a patient man, his mother Sandra giving me that look, that cocktail of pity and suspicion every time we sat down to Sunday lunch. I felt like I was living inside a version of my own life that someone else had narrated, and the narrator had decided I was unstable. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the narrator had been working very, very hard on that story, for a very specific reason. The text from Sandra came on a Tuesday in November. I've already told you what it contained, but let me tell you what it felt like to actually read it. I sat down on my kitchen floor with the phone in both hands, pasta cooling on the stove, rain starting against the window, and I read the screenshots 3 times, then a 4th. Then I put the phone face down on the tile and sat very still for what I think was about 10 minutes, though it might have been 30. The conversation was between Marcus and Sandra from approximately 3 weeks prior. In it, Marcus explained, casually with the tone of someone describing a minor logistical inconvenience, that he needed his mother to back him up on a few things, that he'd told several people, including his friend group and, crucially, his colleague Diane, that I had been struggling emotionally and that he was concerned about my grip on reality. He used that phrase, grip on reality. He told his mother that Diane, who I had met at a work Christmas party and whose warm, friendly manner I had genuinely liked, had been asking questions because people had noticed he seemed off lately. He needed the narrative about me to be airtight, because Diane wasn't just a colleague. In the thread, Marcus referred to her as Di and included a detail, an offhand, devastating detail, that made everything crystallize. Di's flat is closer to the office anyway. It just makes sense on late nights. He had been sleeping with her for at least 8 months. The whole architecture of my apparent instability, the misremembered conversations, the patient sighs, the looks from his friends, the exhausted narrative of me as someone who couldn't quite hold herself together, it had never been about my mental health. It had been about building an exit strategy that left me discredited. If I ever found out, no one would believe me. I'd already been established as unreliable. That was the plan. I want to pause here and be honest with you about what I felt in those first hours. Because I think when women tell these stories, there's pressure to perform a particular kind of strength immediately, to be already forming the plan, already dry-eyed and strategic. I wasn't. I cried so hard I gave myself a headache. I called Priya, the friend who dragged me to the fundraiser where I'd met him, which felt cosmically cruel in that moment, and I couldn't speak for about 2 minutes, just made sounds into the phone while she said, "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here," in a steady rhythm until I could form words. I was devastated. I want you to know that, because the devastation matters. It's the evidence of how real it was to me, how fully I had trusted him, how thoroughly I had loved that first-year version of him and grieved, in real time, his slow disappearance, without ever understanding why he was disappearing. The grief I felt that Tuesday night on my kitchen floor was legitimate, and I'm not going to fast forward through it to get to the satisfying part. But here's the thing about surviving something like that. At a certain point, and for me it was around 2 in the morning when Priya had fallen asleep on my couch and I was still awake, staring at the ceiling, the devastation starts to metabolize into something else, something quieter and colder and far more focused. I picked up my phone. I opened my journal app, the one I'd started keeping to track misremembered conversations because Marcus had made me doubt myself. 18 months of entries. Dates, times, specific wording of conversations, things I said, things he claimed I said, the deltas between those two columns. I read through it with new eyes. It wasn't the journal of a woman with a poor memory. It was a documented record of a 3-year gaslighting campaign. I thought of something my dad used to say. He was a meticulous man, a retired civil engineer who believed in documentation above almost everything else. The paperwork always tells the truth, even when the people don't. Hi, Dad, I thought. I have quite a lot of paperwork. I did not confront Marcus that night. This is the part people always find surprising, because the instinct, the one movies have trained into us, is the dramatic confrontation, throwing things, screaming, making sure he knows that you know, watching his face crumple. I understand that instinct. I felt it. But somewhere under the devastation, a cooler part of my brain said, wait. Because here's what I had to consider. If I confronted Marcus with what I knew, 3 things would happen in rapid succession. First, he would deny it. Second, he would immediately begin damage control among our mutual social circle, reinforcing the narrative about my instability while he still had credibility. He didn't know that I knew. Sandra didn't know she'd sent the screenshots to me. I could only assume she had a minor heart attack when she realized, but she hadn't followed up, which meant she was either hoping I hadn't seen them or waiting to see what I'd do. I had a window, and I intended to use it. The plan I built over the following 2 weeks was not dramatic. It wasn't elaborate. It didn't involve revenge in any theatrical sense of the word. What it involved was something far more powerful in the long run. The truth delivered at the exact right moment to exactly the right people, with receipts. I started with Priya, who, when I showed her the screenshots and my journal, went through her own version of the Tuesday night experience, including the 10-minute silence on my kitchen floor. Then she said, very quietly, "What do you need from me?" I told her. Next, I reached out, carefully, through a mutual acquaintance, to Diane's colleague, a woman named Beth, who'd been at the same Christmas party, and who, it turned out, had her own reasons to find Marcus's pattern of behavior interesting. Beth was cautious at first, then she wasn't. It turned out Diane didn't know about me, either. Not the real me, anyway. She knew Marcus's version, the concerned boyfriend version, the woman who was struggling version. She'd been told we were basically over and had been for a year.
When Beth showed her the timeline, Diane went very still. I know this because Beth texted me afterward with just 4 words. She wants to talk.
Marcus had a work event in mid-December, a holiday drinks thing at a bar in Shoreditch, the kind of event where partners were invited and people got slightly too festive, and photographs ended up on LinkedIn with captions about great teams and gratitude. He had invited me. I said I wouldn't miss it. I want to describe what it felt like to get ready that evening because it was one of the more peculiar emotional experiences of my life. I was calm, not numbly calm, not performance calm, genuinely deeply calm, the way you feel when you've done every piece of preparation possible and all that remains is the thing itself. I wore a green dress I'd bought years ago and never felt quite right in. I felt right in it that night. I did my makeup carefully, not to impress Marcus, but because there's something clarifying about looking like the best version of yourself when you're about to tell an uncomfortable truth. My dad called it dressing for testimony. Priya met me outside the bar. She squeezed my hand once, said, "You good?" I said yes. We went in. Marcus was near the bar when we arrived, holding a glass of red wine and talking to colleagues with the relaxed ease of a man who has no idea what is about to happen to his carefully constructed narrative. He saw me across the room and his face did the thing it always did. Warm smile, slight relief, and he raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement. Diane was there too, standing with a group near the window. She and I made eye contact across the room for exactly 1 second, and in that second I saw that she was ready. What followed was not, as I said, theatrical. I didn't make a speech, I didn't throw a drink, I didn't cause a scene in the way that would have been satisfying in a film, but would have, in reality, simply handed Marcus the narrative he'd been building. See, she's unstable, I told you, on a silver platter. What happened instead was quieter and, in my opinion, far more effective. I spent 40 minutes at that party having normal conversations with the people in Marcus's work circle, the ones who'd absorbed the story about me over the past year. I was articulate and warm and entirely composed. I asked people about their work, their Christmas plans, their kids. I was, by any observable metric, an extremely stable woman having a perfectly pleasant evening. And then, when Marcus was in a loose group of about 8 people that included his manager, a serious, fair-minded woman named Ross, I joined the circle and I said with a pleasant smile, "I actually wanted to say goodbye to everyone properly tonight, since Marcus and I are parting ways. It's been a strange few years, honestly, but I'm grateful I kept good notes." I held up my phone calmly and showed Ross the screenshot Sandra had sent me, just long enough for her to read the relevant section, the part about building a narrative of my instability to manage an ongoing situation at work. Then I put it away. Ross's expression did not change, but her eyes were very still in a way that told me she was already filing information. Marcus, 3 feet away, had gone completely white. I left the party. Priya and I went to a wine bar around the corner and ordered the good stuff, and she told me for the first time that she had never trusted him, had never said anything because I was happy, and she hadn't wanted to be that friend. I told her she was allowed to be that friend going forward, always. We agreed. 3 days later, Marcus texted me asking to talk. I replied with a single sentence. "I've said everything I needed to say, and so has your documentation." Then I blocked him. The karma, when it came cleanly. Marcus was not fired, I want to be clear about that, because I'm not in the business of destroying anyone's livelihood, and what he'd done, while morally comprehensive in its awfulness, wasn't a terminable offense by HR standards. But Ross, it turned out, had already been monitoring a situation involving Marcus and a junior female colleague who had raised a quiet concern several months prior, a concern that had been somewhat difficult to substantiate because Marcus had, characteristically, done a preliminary job of establishing that the colleague was difficult. The screenshots and my documented journal provided what that colleague's complaint had lacked: pattern.
Last I heard, Marcus is at a different company in a smaller role with a significantly shortened professional reference list. Diane and I have never become friends. That wasn't the point, and it would have been strange. But she sent me a message in January that said, "Thank you for being honest with me. I'm sorry it happened to both of us." I saved that message. It still feels like the right ending to that chapter. Sandra never reached out to me directly, but she sent Priya, who was still connected to her on Facebook, a slightly cryptic message that said only, "I hope your friend is well. I always thought she deserved better." Yeah, Sandra, so did I. It just took a little while to get there.
I think about that Tuesday night sometimes. The kitchen floor, the cooling pasta, the rain. The way everything I thought I understood about my own life turned out to be narrated by someone else. And I think about what I almost did, which was confront him immediately, loudly, emotionally, in a way that would have confirmed every word of the story he'd spent 3 years constructing. How close I came to handing him his ending. What I learned, what that whole painful, prolonged, deeply unfair experience eventually gave me, is this. When someone tries to make you doubt your own mind, the most radical thing you can do is trust yourself enough to wait, to document, to breathe, to let the truth do what the truth, given time and the right room, always does. It tells itself. I'm not going to tell you I'm completely healed from it. I have days when I still question my memory of a conversation. I probably always will. But I also have 18 months of journal entries that proved beyond any reasonable doubt that my memory was never the problem. And I have a green dress that finally fits right. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been gaslit by someone you trusted completely? Have you ever had the truth arrive in the most unexpected way, from the least expected person? Drop your story below. You never know who needs to read it. And if you know someone who needs to hear that they're not crazy, please share this video. Sometimes that's the whole thing. Just someone saying, "I believe you. You weren't imagining it." See you in the next one.